Okay, so we've got an all-star panel here today, and the first question that I wanted to start y'all off with is kind of more your personal psychology or your lived experience, so to speak. And that is like when this is about grad school for counseling. And like when were you like in graduate school for counseling when you noticed like something's off here, like something doesn't seem quite right? So who wants to start with that question?
I'll jump in. I mean, I would say like just from the application stage, I could tell that there was going to be some sort of an ideological angle on it when it's asking about my, I can't remember exactly what the question was, but how I plan on incorporating, you know, the ideals of diversity and inclusion in my counseling work and as at I don't think it was in my counseling work, but like as a student. And so I was like, that's interesting because I wasn't expecting to see that. So then it went on from there, but it was out there from the very beginning.
Yeah, I can say from my experience in retrospect, it was there from the beginning. And I was aware that the field was definitely on the left of center. But, having been part of different groups that were fairly on the left, like I went to a Unitarian church prior to that and had a lot of friends in the theater, in the arts, and that sort of thing, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. When it hit me in the moment was talking to one of the doc students who had, we had several that were working with each one of our different professors. And there was just something about the overly happiness, just the kind of mannerisms that really kind of tweaked me in a way that reminded me of people who were really religious, like really, like you couldn't
Mm.
have a conversation with them outside of those angles. And it was a small feeling, but I just remember feeling, it's just like this feels just a little bit culty. Like I didn't quite want to completely admit it to myself, but I felt it. And that's how it played out for me.
Yeah, I hear that, Susanna. For me, I picked up on small things here or there, like maybe the first year, but it was the cross-cultural counseling class and a lot of the struggle session, specifically the post George Floyd struggle session, where the religious nature of it really hit me in the face, and it felt very like just like a testimonial, or like you kind of have to like sit in a circle and everyone cries, shares the pain that they're experiencing. And it did feel very religious. And so I think it was maybe like a year in where it finally clicked for me that this wasn't just a few comments or it wasn't specific professors. It was actually like a core part of the program.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a question I've asked myself. I'm not sure. Looking back, and I'd always been left wing. I'd always been, a liberal oriented person. So I don't think I had a language around what this new way of talking was, but I knew that there was something, and I knew that it was kind of weird to me, and I didn't like it. And I felt like it was a false, strange trend that people were picking up. And so I kind of wondered if this course was going to have a lot of that. I knew that that was pretty prevalent in Seattle, and my course was smack dab in downtown Seattle, my university. And it was definitely there in the first interview, the pre-matriculation interview, when we did sort of a group interview. And as we went around, I think the first prompt was to introduce yourself, including your pronouns. And that was so jarring to me. And I felt really gross that I participated in it. I really tried to articulate what was uncomfortable about that. Like there was a woman in that group interview who was clearly a woman, and she was wearing makeup and a dress and, total everything female, and introduced herself with they, them. And it was the first time I'd heard somebody do that. And I thought, why would this be encouraged? And then she was accepted into the program. That was our interview to like our final stage of gatekeeping, I suppose, before we were brought in. She was accepted into the program, and it just really, it deeply disturbed me that this was acceptable for counselors. So that was the first time it was very overt, and I had a undeniable experience with it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, something that I noticed that like with Gabrielle, you talked about, we're here for diversity. And Leslie, you talked about, we're going to start by saying our pronouns. There's like these little things that kind of contribute to an atmosphere where there's a lot of other stuff that goes unspoken. There's a lot of expectations that you just kind of know are there, even though nobody explicitly said it out loud. And I feel like a lot of stuff gets censored. And Gabrielle, I was having lunch at your house, and your son was like, well, "Why didn't you say like blah blah blah?" I'm like, "No, you don't understand. Like the boundaries are like a mile away from there. Like you couldn't even get close to there." And so I'm wondering if you could kind of just talk about what it feels like with these like hidden, unspoken expectations that are constantly hanging in the air.
Yeah, it's very, very real. And it's hard to, looking back, I do, sometimes wish that I had been more overt and more outspoken and maybe pushing back a little bit. But then again, I don't think it would have gone any better than I, suspected it would have at the time. You get a sense just like from largely from the other students. In my experience, I know that everybody has their own experiences with what the professors were like. In my experience, it felt like it was mostly coming from other students more than, I mean, somewhat from the professors as well, but like how quickly they are to agree with each other, to be giving their opinions, but only in a particular lane, definitely only in one lane. So maybe differently from some of the rest of you, came from a largely conservative political orientation. I have been just by nature and my education most of my life. And so, you know, I was kind of used to sort of being on the outside like that. And I definitely felt it there where I'm like, I don't agree with your opinions. I know that I know that my opinions are not going to be welcome here. And so you can just keep your mouth shut, which I did most of the time.
Yeah, I certainly relate to that. There was a culture where it didn't even occur to anyone that someone could have a different perspective or political opinion. Like it didn't even cross their mind. Everyone just sort of talked as if we all agreed because duh. And they, perceive it as almost like and it's actually codified in like some of the K-CREB standards, but like, just part of what you need to be a counselor. So like you can just kind of assume that you're going to be politically progressive in that kind of way. And I also like the word that I would use, hopefully it's okay to say this word, is circle jerk. Like I would observe a lot of that kind of thing where it's just a lot of the classes or everyone just sort of like a political, maybe like virtue signaling, that kind of thing. And so it was just that kind of like vibe or culture. I don't know if that really counts as being unsaid, but it was so totalizing that it didn't even occur to anyone that like there was another perspective.
Yeah, I want the rest of you to add in, but I just want to like completely agree with that. And I was in grad school during I started in the fall of 2019. So I was in that span of when COVID began, the George Floyd, all of that during that summer, and then the election following fall. And just like, just the freedom with which everybody could say their very political opinions, just with this absolute conviction that everybody there is going to agree with them. And like no thought whatsoever about what it would be like for somebody that doesn't agree. And of course I didn't agree. And so I'm extremely aware of that asymmetry and that imbalance there.
That's a great point, Gabrielle. I had a lot of professors who would like tell you that according to our ethics, you're not supposed to bring any politics into like your therapy room. But one professor said it's okay to endorse Black Lives Matter. Another professor of mine said, "Oh, it's okay to have like a pride flag, the Progress Pride flag in your office, because those are not political statements. It's just like a personal representation of who you are." And it's very obvious that one line of thought is acceptable and all others are not.
Oh, I would agree too. Even here in Tennessee, there was a lot of talk about the local political environment here. And I started in August of 2022, which was shortly after they had passed legislation here where uh, what they call divisive concepts were not supposed to be taught in higher education, and it included it. The law here in Tennessee iterates exactly what that is. Saying that one race is responsible for the problems of another, or that there's systematic oppression. Personally, I think that iterating it like that, there's some legal compromises, but it did spell it out, and yet that is what they were teaching. And they knew that. And they would comment about how Tennessee had made other laws. One of the laws they made here in Tennessee was that you, as a therapist, could deny a client if what they were asking was conflicted with your personal views. And the professors spoke about how that was bad because that was tantamount to abandoning clients. And it was always a gendered and sexual orientation problem that they brought up with regard to that these people are getting left out because of this bad Tennessee law. And there were also prior to me coming in, there was a lot of fighting about CRT in the K through 12 schools. And one of the professors bragged about how, oh yeah, we can talk about, CRT all we want here because we're in higher education. And, now that I've dug into the law a little bit, I'm a little, just a little bit jarring.
Yeah, it's interesting how I think we absorb these sorts of attitudes and social trends and socially orthodox ways of behaving, without overtly and directly being taught them. And so that sort of attitude in the air is a very real thing. I think the boundaries and the taboos, even without anybody explicitly teaching them to you. And I'm really fascinated by this. I felt like I had a sense of what the right things were to say and the right attitudes about things like race and white privilege and these kinds of things. And at the same time, I did feel like I was at a bit of a distance from them. And I had this sense of like, did I miss a lesson? I remember when I was in elementary school and everybody had these clocks that they'd made with you remember the little brads that you stick through and then you have the little paper. Everybody had these and I didn't have one. And I thought, that's so weird because I don't think I missed a day. But I must have. I must have like been sick because everybody had these things that they'd completed and I had no clock and I had no memory of that lesson. And I remember just being so puzzled by how they did that and how I didn't, because I wasn't sick. I must have been, but I didn't think I had been. And I had that feeling in this grad program. Like I hear everybody using these kinds of words and this kind of statement. And I have a sense that I'm supposed to too. But I don't, when did you guys learn this? When did you so dramatically depart from the way that we used to talk about human interaction? The last time I took a psychology class. So yeah, there were a lot of those and with every other concept in psychology, they're really explicit about teaching you who are the big thinkers who brought us this way of looking at it. And this one was it was like this overlay that was this implied new way of interacting.
Yeah, it's so bizarre how it's like I don't remember anyone ever explicitly saying any of these things, but everybody knows. Everybody knows what opinion you're supposed to take. The truth that is like, even though we pretend to be relativists, like there is like an absolute truth that we're pushing. We just don't really talk about it in those terms. So the big weed out class to determine if you're left wing enough, I think for all of us was like the Counseling the Culturally Diverse class, and I think we all used the Gerald Wing Sue book. Some of even my very progressive classmates referred to this class as Wokeness 101. I'm wondering if anybody has any opinions on the multicultural training that you get in counselor grad programs.
A million opinions about it. I don't know. Where do you want to start?
Go for it.
I mean, it's sophomoric. It's childish. A lot of it feels made up. The Sue book, Gabrielle and I have done, 2 different videos, maybe 3? 3? Yeah, we dove into this book. I've got it here because I brought it over to the desk to work through it with Gabrielle. If you're interested in checking those out, they're really in depth and we just really get into it and read it and respond to it. It is bizarre. It's a study on humans as if we are animals in the zoo. This is how white people develop their identity. This is how Black people develop their identity. This is the proper arc of white identity development should look like. This is how the white person sees things at different parts of their life. It's really strange, and it's a bunch of false teaming, a bunch of assumptions made about people based on these really superficial characteristics, and it's chock full of like evidence and anecdotes that are all basically in the same voice. So it feels like the authors just sat down and created these straw men in order to, basically bolster their own theories. So that's kind of a start, but I have many more thoughts. We could talk all day about this.
Yeah, I have a little bit different perspective on that because I stepped out before I got into that particular class, but it was something that they had put on the horizon as, everybody's going to have a hard time in this class. It's going to be terrible. And, it's really going to press you to, re-examine yourself and your own identity. But I come at it from having looked up the textbooks across the country for all of the KCREP accredited classes and then getting those textbooks and, looking through them. And they're all varieties of, internally referential. A lot of them refer back to the Sioux book, but in some states they'll straight up use like white fragility as their textbook. There are places that are doing that, and other obviously highly politically motivated ones. One of the worst ones, and this is a book that came out, and I think it's being used at one, maybe two universities. I'd have to look up in my spreadsheet, but it's called Decolonizing Therapy. And the whole thing, there's the woman that wrote it seems very angry, but she's trying to organize, different classes, and it goes through, and the whole thing is incredibly racialized about, how bad the colonialism is and how, that needs to be eradicated from the profession. Just, almost 200 pages. And you try and read through it. Most of these things, you try and read through them, and they're written in a way so that the conversation is kind of circular. If you try and look for a quote where they're saying succinctly what it is they're trying to say, it's really hard to find. But if you read what they're saying and you parse it, you're like, it's kind of like, well, what you're saying is that white people are bad, right? And, that's one of the things that's really frustrating about trying to write and present this to people because, when they write it in that way, it's hard to say, just look at it. But if you can't get somebody to read through it, they're like, I don't know what this is saying, or like, this doesn't make sense, or this is awful. Some of the sections are so egregious that it's disgusting.
I'm sure Katie has a lot of thoughts on this. She's our, kind of our decolonial expert here. But I wanted to say, like, when you say, like, we need to decolonize, like, colonialism is bad, I think there's a certain type of person that would say, like, wow, coming in and enslaving a population or racism, like, these things are bad. Like, I think we should all be against that. But what they actually mean when they use that term decolonial or decolonize is, like, they're casting out, like, a whole group of things that are attached to whiteness. So the scientific method would be colonialism that we need to cast off. Personal responsibility, being on time, saving for a rainy day. These are all part of colonialism that we need to cast off. And you start realizing now, you're like, wow, we're really throwing out some pretty useful things. So go ahead.
Yeah, so just piggybacking on what Susanna was talking about, assuming that I'm thinking of the right book, Decolonizing Therapy was written by someone named Dr. Jennifer Mullen, who describes herself as the, quote, rage doctor, who, quote, um, like alchemizes intergenerational trauma. She very obviously pulls from Franz Fanon, so like in that context, it's extremely concerning what that implies. But she has something called the colonial soul wound, which funnily enough, she trademarked it, so it's intellectual property. It's just called the colonial soul wound. But among the things in there are like, belief in colonial systems. So like if you don't want to overthrow the free market, like that would be evidence that you have a colonial soul wound, something like that. But just kind of circling back to this, like counseling the culturally diverse, or for me, it was cross-cultural counseling. And just to be clear, so I did not go to a KCREP school. I know this is the KCREP panel, so I just want to be clear about that. I went to an MPCAC school, but we basically more or less just follow the KCREP program so that we can get licensed. But like, I'll just be blunt. I think that class in general is like a Marxist cult induction, basically. Like you're expected to go through like a Freudian death and rebirth, like they would call it like an existential Easter. like a death and rebirth on the side of the oppressed. So like seeing things from the quote, like the what the Maoists would call it would be the people standpoint. So seeing it from the people standpoint, they want you to, basically kill your old self and, be reborn on this, revolutionary side, basically. So in that sense, like it's, I mean, not only like inappropriate and probably like a little bit abusive because like a core part of that, experience has to come through like a pedagogy of discomfort. Like you're supposed to feel uncomfortable. That's why they kind of emphasize like, oh, a lot of people are going to be feeling uncomfortable or they're going to, have questions or it's going to make you squirm, like that kind of thing. Like that's a core part of the learning experience that they're trying to angle for. But, it's also like a little bit perhaps of like a First Amendment violation because I think it would be solidly within the realm of like a cult, like a Marxist cult religion. And so having counselors have to undergo that is highly questionable from that perspective.
It's a really good point, Katie. I think that's a really good point. I don't think that counselors should have to undergo that. And that right now is the only way to go through a counseling program in most of the US. And there's one thing that really epitomizes this wound that they're trying to inflict upon you, and they are trying to inflict a wound on you that you carry forward. You look at the land acknowledgments, which are not very popular in the U.S., not as much as they are in Canada. You see them there a lot; they're required, but it's this: we acknowledge that this is stolen land, so this is something we are guilty. And yet we're not going to do anything about it, but we're going to tell you that we really feel bad. And we're going to all demonstrate our guilt and how bad we feel about it. And that's kind of what this whole white privilege thing is. They don't give you a way to resolve it. This sort of racial tension that they're implanting in the room, in their counseling trainees. Feel bad about this and learn these ways to talk about how you feel bad about this and make sure that you use these phrases often to show that you feel bad about this. But there's no resolution for this. There's not like some sticker that you get or some letters after your name that you receive once you've passed through this process and you are now a good white person, because you'll never be a good white person. You'll always be someone who's carrying like the mark of Cain. You're just walking around marked as a bad person, but you can alleviate that a little bit by paying these fees perpetually in demonstration of your guilt. So it's a bizarre thing to graft onto a profession that's meant to help people heal and become strong and resilient and self-motivated. So I think it's an incredibly strange, I think the word cult has been used a couple of times, and it very much resembles that.
I was thinking, what you were saying earlier, Leslie, about how this class is so different from the others in that it's not academic really in that, well, I mean, it has sort of like the form of academia and that it has like references and things like that, but they're all just internally generated. I think it was after I had completed the course. Has anybody read, I think it's Cynical Theories, the James Lindsay book, right? Okay. So I had wished that I had read that book before I had the class, but he does a really great job. I think it's him and his co-author do a great job, like giving sort of the academic underpinnings of all of these critical theories and where it comes from. And it was very eye-opening to me. And it's not like these ideas come out of nowhere, like they come from something. But the way that it's presented in my grad program, at least, like we didn't get any of that. It is just presented as if it is God's truth, the word of God. Here is your Bible. This is not like, well, this is what this is where these studies come from. This is the theory underpinning it. Like this goes back to, ultimately Marxism a long time ago, but there's a huge thought process that goes from there. But like these are not like, it's not God's truth coming down from some. It was very frustrating to me, but that it was presented in that way. It felt very academically dishonest to not be honest about where these things come from, so that you could have an honest debate about whether or not you actually even agree with some of the assumptions that are baked in.
That's right. And I think that in most academic programs that I've been a part of, there's a great deal of effort made to define our terms. So here's a concept, here's the definition for it, here's some, context. And these are not given that at all. It's as if, it's as if it's the water you're swimming in and they don't see it. It's so interesting. I think, Ryan, you were mentioning that the professor who was preaching apolitical presence, but then endorsing a Black Lives Matter flag, like they really they're either denying it on purpose and they do know that it's political, or they're oblivious to the fact that these are political gestures.
I want to stop and point something out. And I feel like there may be some listener who, like several people have mentioned Marxism and cult, and Katie mentioned it's a Marxist cult. And I feel like there might be some people like, you guys are exaggerating, like you're like way overselling this. I don't think it's an exaggeration in any way. In the Daryl Wing Sue book, like it's explicitly pushing you towards this racialized Marxism. And it presents it as though you're supposed to have kind of this divine revelation. Is like, you'll have an epiphany, a revelation. Your eyes will be opened. They even describe it as like kind of like a form of ecstasy, like a spiritual ecstasy when you realize how racist you really are. And then you kind of overcome that by this realization of essentially critical race theory. Like it does not seem like at all to me to exaggerate by saying that this is a Marxist cult. And I'm wondering if we could flesh that part out a little bit more. Y'all are already doing a really good job of that.
Yeah,
So
so
jump in.
like if you think about the sort of oppressor oppressed matrix, it was sort of adapted. I'm thinking, for example, of Kimberly Crenshaw, and I could probably grab it, but I got one of those old counseling, the culturally diverse books from like the early 2000s, just out of curiosity to see the citations and things like that. And I'm like 99% sure that Kimberly Crenshaw is explicitly cited in it, but it takes that oppressor oppressed matrix and then sort of like applies it at different, like intersectional types. So for us, like Pamela Hayes would be addressing age, you know, gender, like all those different kinds of characteristics. So like heteronormative, so straight versus not straight, or like Christian, like a WASP versus not WASP, like that kind of thing. So they can basically turn it into anything. But it's also like they explicitly cite Paulo Freire. And Paulo Freire is or was a Marxist educator from Recife, Brazil, who is in like this liberation theology paradigm that's basically Marxism with a little bit of Catholic coding. But that's like a central part of all of this. So it's, the experiential aspect and maybe the more like ideological or like religious doctrinal aspect are very much Marxist.
Sort of pressed that's just baked into even like all of the counseling classes. The power differential was frequently cited. If you don't know where some of these things come from, like once you know where they come from, then you start hearing these words, and like this to me is like also really characteristic of Marxist thought, or this new way of thinking, where you have like these words that mean one thing, that they mean it in a particular way, but the vast majority of the general public don't understand that that's how these words are being used, very precisely. Um, and so when you start hearing some of these like coded words, and I'm just looking at the other students in my program, I'm like, they don't know where this is coming from. Like easy ones, equity, right? That just sounds like a nice thing, and we believe in equity. And my sister's a middle school teacher, and one of the values of their school is equity. And I was having a conversation with her, like, what does that mean to you? And she's got a very nice and sunshine and roses view of what equity means, and she doesn't realize that like that's a precise mean with a like word with a particular meaning within this context. And it's all over the place in the counseling field, and it's a very strange thing, because I don't like the merging of Marxism and counseling. I mean, why? I don't. It's yeah, frustrating.
I think for me, what makes this culty and why I would describe that is maybe a little bit less about the communism and more about the tactics in the way that the groups function. So, for example, there can't be dissent. So, someone who is even like slightly out of alignment with the overall narrative is vilified and driven out. And, it's something that, happened to me and happened to Leslie and happened to Lauren and other people as well. I think whenever you see group dynamics where people are being actively ostracized, that's a real good indicator that something is not healthy there. And there is the ideology and there is the adherence to the ideology, To be in the group with people where that's present, though, the way you feel it is there are, you notice that you start to silence yourself. You look at your classmates and you wonder, can I broach this subject? What if I was to say in private something about, does this seem right to you? And that seems really dangerous. It seems really dangerous. And you also start to notice that there are some people in the group that seem to have like a special relationship with the faculty and that sort of thing. And there may be small groups where there's talking that other people are not allowed to talk in. That's for me where it feels really culty, because there's obviously not an open exchange of honest information happening. And one of the things that came up repeatedly, and I heard the faculty, they would say this, they said it, in several different circumstances, but they talked about how the program there was incestuous. And that's the word that they used, is, how the faculty, and particularly the doc students, because they were there so much and worked so closely with the faculty, but how the whole department was incestuous. And for me, that's what makes it, it goes from being just, we're trying to, you know, be a little pressurizing, to we've gone really far in a, unhealthy direction.
If I could just piggyback on that quickly to just sort of give people an understanding of how like cults are structured, because I'm imagining someone hearing this, like maybe a counselor themselves and thinking like, I'm not in a cult, like that kind of thing. But the way cults typically operate is that you have like an outer and an inner cult. So, maybe the more academic level or like the higher up kind of thing would be the inner cult, where they understand the language, they understand, what's in like the academic literature, for example, and then it's just sort of filtered out into like vague language like social justice or, empowerment, like that kind of thing, like filtered out to this outer cult who is more inducted in like a social emotional way rather than like a doctrinal way. So like they're like in the vibe, and I think a lot of people in counseling kind of understand like they're like a vibe or an attitude that you're supposed to just sort of have. I actually have something quickly from the 2024 K-CREP standards. They call it a professional disposition. And so this is kind of how it's enforced in this sort of social emotional rather than doctrinal way, where it's the commitments, characteristics, values, beliefs, and behaviors that influence a counselor's professional growth in interactions with clients, faculty, supervisors, and peers, including working in a diverse, multicultural, and global society with marginalized populations. So they just kind of like, you know, create basically social emotional standards and like a social emotional way of kind of entering this quote unquote cult. And I think cult is like the correct term to be applying here. But I just wanted to clarify that because I can understand if people think that they don't have any idea about any of this background or the details, that it could still like it still operates in this kind of way.
I want to add to that and see if we can get a topic out of this. And, Katie, the way you phrased it was the inner and outer cult. And the way I like to say it's like a religion, in the sense that like there's the true believers, there's the people who are willing to kill and die for the faith. And then there's people who go along with it because that's just what we do here. Like there's atheists who say God bless you because that's just kind of what you say. There's professors who are not super on board, who put their pronouns in their email sign off because that's just what we do here. And I'm wondering, like, when y'all are looking at this field and grad programs for counseling, are you able to differentiate or separate out who are the true believers and who's just kind of going along with it out of peer pressure, I guess?
That's a really
Gabrielle?
difficult one.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think it's really difficult to tell. I wondered that at different points. My professor for the multicultural counseling course, I wondered, what are your motivations here? Do you really believe this? And I think it's really clear that the paradigm of oppressor and oppressed sets up a system of basically debts, and entitlements. So people who are more privileged, they have debts back to society, and to the people who are more oppressed, who have more entitlements. And I think that system it's really easy to internalize. So I'm not sure, that distinction. I think that's a fantastic question, how to tell who's a true believer. But I do think there were little things like people who didn't put their pronouns on their name tags. You'd wonder, Did you just leave it off because you forgot? Or is that an act of sort of defiant omission? It was very difficult to tell. I'm sorry, I cut in, Gabrielle. I think you were going to say something.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I had and I have very serious concerns. So I was an older student when I was going through my program. There was a wide variety of ages, but I would say probably most students were in their 20s. You know, there was a range. But I think that I look at some of the younger people, and then like I have some serious concerns about what's happening in the K-12 system in our country, just because I think Leslie, you had talked about earlier about feeling like you missed a lesson somewhere, and I think a lot of where that is coming from is the K-12 system right now, which is really different than it was back in the 80s and 90s when I was in school. When I was in my graduate program, though, like there were certain signals that I was able to intuit a handful of other students that didn't totally buy into these things. And masking was one of those things because I was in the program right during COVID. And in Texas, the state legislature at one point said, okay, you cannot require masking anymore. And so I was like, woohoo. And I went to school not wearing my mask. And I went into my class and everybody still had the mask on except for one person. And it was interesting to me. Like, man, did I feel the pressure to put that mask back on? I felt that pressure. I did not put it back on. And I sat next to the person who also wasn't wearing a mask. I'm like, I got a new friend here. You're looking for some of these things, but I do worry about also just like the self-selection process, where the counseling field is I think more and more filled with people who are on board because like if you can tolerate this gauntlet run through this program where you're going to just be at every turn faced with feeling like you don't belong, that you're wrong, or that you can't speak your mind, or that you're being force fed things that you find really appalling. It's just more and more going to be filled with the true believers that I have. I was looking at just briefly, I found this on the website of the group practice where I currently practice in. And like I would have thought that our group practice was like really mostly apolitical, but on the website of my practice, it has a statement that goes through like, we realize those who have suffered great injustices have more barriers to engaging fully with emotional safety and counseling. We acknowledge oppression in our community and the impact this has had on seeking the non judgment that is central to the therapeutic relationship. It goes through, to that end, we want every person who seeks support at our practice to know that we as therapists recognize our own various privileges as well as experiences of oppression. Acknowledge that we have made mistakes and contributed to systemic racism, are committed to learning the best ways possible to help our clients, which include challenging our own points of view and the majority harmful narratives that show up in society. So like that's frustrating because I like don't actually I'm not on board with any of those statements, and I didn't even know that this was on like the website of my group practice, but that's just how the assumptions are just baked in that this is what every therapist believes. And so yeah, I find that troubling to say the least.
It reminds me of like if you go on like a church website, like, what we believe, like that kind of thing. Like that's the vibe that it gives me. It's like a statement of faith.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was just looking for the civility pledge that my school instituted because it's kind of like that, Gabrielle. I had a screenshot of it a while back. I'm not going to find it quickly, but that was sort of the end of my rope with the program. I tried and tried to make it through massaging the words into the picture that they wanted. And finally they came out with this pledge that we had to sign publicly. We were supposed to do this in our forum for our class, state that you agree with the civility pledge. And when I read it, it wasn't something I could get on board with. But I think I'm just responding to that little statement. I don't remember the main question that you had asked, Ryan.
Yeah, it was just about differentiating who are the true believers and who just kind of goes along with the crowd.
Yeah, I do actually. I have something to add on this one. When I was in that multicultural class, it was It was a really difficult, not difficult, it was a really messy class. It was bad in a couple of ways. The content we've already talked about a little bit, but also there were administrative and format issues. The teacher was really sloppy. She didn't give us a mid-semester review. She didn't respond to things we turned in. She didn't respond to people's questions. Just there was a lot. It was a very poorly administered course in a lot of ways. So there was the structural and procedural stuff that was just as bad as the content. So I asked a few questions or pushed back that tension we were talking about earlier, where there's these taboos around you and this orthodoxy that's kind of unspoken. I carried that tension with me all the time in that course, and it was really uncomfortable. And I didn't want to strongly push back and make an enemy of everybody. I didn't want a target on myself, but I also felt compelled to ask some things and probe a little bit about this and that. So I was pretty much the only student engaging with the material in the lectures in a way that was not 100%, yes, I see my white privilege.
Mm.
And I had a few people outside of class comment to me, thanking me. I got emails. I had people who I would see out in the break room or some study room would thank me for something that I'd said or kind of offer a complaint about the class. Nobody ever came directly out and said, "Yeah, this is anti-white racist BS." So I never got a sense that somebody was like it was kind of like the mask you're talking about, Gabrielle. It's like they didn't have their mask on for a moment in those discussions where they were telling me that they appreciated something I'd said in the course, but they didn't come right out and say, "Yeah, I don't believe in COVID," or something like that. It was something I wondered though. So those people were perhaps like-minded, but perhaps also just responding to the procedural issues in the course.
I think there's also a contingent of people who, once they get into this, realize that it works to their benefit.
Mm.
And, do they believe it or not? I couldn't really say, but they have discovered that it is a wedge that they can use to get what they want, particularly if they are one of the people that fits in one of those intersectionalities that is deemed as, these are, the most oppressed or the most marginalized. And I definitely saw some of that in my program where, those were the people that would be the most aggressive in trying to enforce this ideology because they benefited. It was a power move that they were able to take advantage of.
That's a really good point. So I feel like some people could potentially be watching this and say, like, okay, you had to say land acknowledgement, you had to say your pronouns. That's kind of annoying, but it doesn't really negatively impact therapy. Like, I'm wondering if y'all saw things that, due to the ideological bias, actually makes therapy worse or goes against what you would think is a good practice for mental health care.
I can definitely talk about that. And I would say that the big thing is that we didn't talk about good therapy very much. We had a little bit where we would have the theories class, and the way the program worked where I was is, after that first semester that I participated in, they would immediately go into practicum. But we spent so much time talking about oppressor oppressed and different groups and how to manage those kind of intersectional situations. We didn't actually talk about how do you help somebody with your problems. We talked about how to broach the subjects of racism. And it's like, one of my big frustrations that early on was probably an indicator of a problem is whenever we would do a role play or something along those lines, the examples that people wanted to do were of anxious college students. And I would want to push the boundaries. It's like, let's pretend to be alcoholics, or let's, try to do it, where there's like severe trauma or that sort of thing. And there was no desire to do that at all. In fact, I was, looked at as, this was beyond the pale to even suggest that we do those things, because then the other students would have to be pretending to be bad, which, how are they supposed to go forward and work with people who actually have those things if they can't and aren't willing to put themselves into those sorts of mindsets and situations? I thought it was really falling down on those counts very strongly.
Well, I think this is like a useful clarifying point is that, it's when we talk about like, oh, it's just land acknowledgments or it's just like, these little things that we have to do that like Marxism and its various derivatives are less ideology and more practice. So it's like what you do. So not only are we expected to like literally be activists like in our private time, but this is also being applied on like psychologically vulnerable people in the context of professional therapy. So we're talking about raising our clients' consciousness. And that's like an explicit thing. Like raising critical consciousness is a part of the social justice and I forget what it's called. It's like cultural and social justice competencies or something like that from the ACA. So it's not just like what we're doing in grad school. Like this is something that we're like meant to apply on our clients. Like hence what Susanna was talking about with the quote unquote broaching, that kind of thing. I'm thinking, for example, of like Sue's like racial identity model, and I think the last stage includes like anti-racist action, which is basically being critically conscious. And so like circling a little bit back to the cult topic, I mean this is basically like inducting or what's the word I'm looking for, like initiating our clients into the same cult. So we're expected to have this critical consciousness and then we're expected to develop it or raise it, which is both like awareness and action. So it's awareness of these various systems of intersectional power and privilege and oppression. Like, for example, what Gabrielle was reading earlier, like we recognize our privilege, blah, blah, blah. And it's also the agency and the action ability to critique and do activism and revolution to change it. Like those go together. So like that's literally what we're doing on our clients, on like psychologically vulnerable people who are coming to us for help. Like that's, the professional standard.
I will say the land acknowledgement or privilege acknowledgement and the pronouns, I don't think that that's just a harmless, annoying thing at all. In fact, yes, agreeing with what Katie just said. And I think that how that's really detrimental to therapy and good therapeutic practice is that it's fundamentally very confusing. It's meant to be confusing. It doesn't offer you any kind of coherence. If the pronoun ritual had gone something like that at that interview, for instance, had gone something like this, like, okay, we're going to go around in a circle. Please introduce yourself, include your name. And if you have any pronoun requests or preferences, can you please state those as well? Well, maybe that's an endorsement of gender ideology and some people would still have a problem with it, but at least it's logically coherent because it's saying that there are some people who may appear androgynous or not appear in a way that you're going to be able to guess how they like to think of themselves. And so if those people can go ahead and please in this polite way inform us that they have a preference or a request, we have all kind of implicitly agreed to be polite and respect that and go along with that. That would have made sense. But to go around in a circle and pretend like we just don't know whether we're speaking to men or women, but it's important for us to memorize these little details about each other's, preferences, and that someone who presents like Ryan could say she, her, and that would be as normal as he's saying he, him, that this is really confusing. Also, the privilege statements, the land acknowledgement kind of stuff where we're going to performatively self-flagellate, but then we're not going to offer any constructive ways forward to move through that. Like, okay, so this is the land acknowledgement and we're doing everything we can to return the land to the people we stole it from. But no, we're just going to say that we stole it and then go about our business. These things, my favorite therapy cartoon that I've ever seen is this little meme of this little cartoon of a client sitting in a chair across from a therapist, and there's these talk bubbles or these speech bubbles above their heads. The client's is a big tangle of yarn, a string, and then the therapist is in their talk bubble. It's rolling into a nice ball. And so this is the process of sitting with another person and helping them to sort through the things in their life that don't make sense to them or that they haven't figured out how these patterns interact with each other, helping them to develop a coherent narrative that they can make sense of and take action going forward and make goal-oriented choices. And to introduce something into the therapeutic relationship that it's like you could redraw that cartoon, the jumble of yarn on the client, and then the therapist takes it and ties bunches of knots in it and then loops it into three big clumps of knotty string. So that's basically what introducing critical theory is. Here's your white saviorism, but here's using your privilege, and they're exactly the same. It's exactly the same paradigm. I think that is a real harm. There is the raising of the critical consciousness, the raising of the racial identity salience, which we're supposed to do regardless of what the client comes in for. We're supposed to make them feel better about being a Black person, worse about being a white person, and angrier about being a Black person and guiltier about being a white person. These are really harmful. These doesn't need to be much else for that to be really bad for clients.
I would say just, similarly, the counseling program, like the time that you're spending in the classes, like, that is kind of, there are trade-offs. So any time that you're spend teaching one thing, you're not spending teaching another. And so that was, definitely something that I was amazed by is like we had some great basic skills classes that I thought were really good, but very little actual like here's how you help counsel a person with depression or anxiety. We had our theories class, which was giving sort of the basics, but not any real practical, like, here's how to do counseling. And a lot of that you had to do on your own. I was surprised by that. And so, and yet we had an entire class about racial identity models that was, completely, in my opinion, being in practice, like a complete waste of time at best and like very actively harmful at worst. So like there's that part of it, but then also like I just think about like the whole like political bent to this, and 50% of people in this country at least are right of center according to our last election, maybe even slightly more than that. And I've had many clients that have sought me out because of word of mouth. They discover that I'm not a woke counselor. And there are many people that are so fearful of even, it's, and I work with some adolescents and, families that are very fearful of bringing their adolescent to a counselor and having it just be another indoctrination session. So it's like we're doing such a disservice to 50% of the population that does not feel safe going to counseling because of how politically biased it is. And that to me is a big problem because I still have faith and believe in the profession that I work within.
I want to jump off of Gabrielle's point right there. That's a really good point you made. I know Leslie has talked about, I think the line was, we're not trying to treat the Trump supporter. And they haven't
It
said
was
that.
even worse than that.
Oh, what was it?
We know we're no longer training counselors who are able to work with the Trump supporter.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't said that as explicitly in my program, but there's a general idea and general attitude that Trump supporters are icky. Like you ideally wouldn't want one as a client, and certainly any therapist who voted for Trump is too ignorant and b immoral to be able to ethically treat people. I'm wondering what you see in terms of that overt political bias.
Yeah, I mean, just that. I mean, like when I was in my program and it was during the election, and it's like, who are the people that you would be most, like most concerned working with, and it was like, yeah, it was definitely. It was. I'm trying to think if I don't know. I'm trying to be as fair as I can. I don't remember anybody bringing up any other population other than like some undesirable political, group that was you know everybody was perfectly fine working with people of all sort of sexualities and races and all this kind of thing. But yeah, the the political stuff was very clear.
That came up in my program when we discussed what our nightmare client was. We had, the class was arranged kind of in a circle, and each person described what they thought the worst possible client would look like. And to a person, they all said a racist white man would be the worst, not a pedophile, not you know, a narcissist or a psychopath, but a racist white man. And when it got to me, I was one of the last ones called on, and I said a narcissist and a psychopath. I was chastised by my professor saying, why would you be worried about a psychopath? All they need is love. And it's just like,
Wow.
yeah, it's like, okay. And it bothered me so much. I scheduled a meeting to go in with him and, talk to him about that. And, I went in and, described some of the experiences that I had that, that fear is kind of based on. And I later came to find out that that professor had written or, had recorded that as I had problems with men. And I just got to say, I mean, if that was true, I am either, the most conflicted person or like the most ballsy to go in and have a private meeting with my male teacher to say, yeah, I have a problem with you. It just defies so much of that stuff, just defies logic when you start to think about it even just a little bit. But with regard to the politics, it's definitely not a safe place for clients, particularly male clients. And talking to people outside in other avenues since then, describing this, I've heard many men say that they would never go on those grounds. And in particular, there are a lot of men who are concerned if they go to therapy that their rights will be taken away because, if there's like a custody issue or if they have firearms, there's concerns that that therapeutic situation will put them in a position where they will lose, those rights because they feel like it is organized against them. And I can't disagree based on what I saw.
Well, I think the bias is, it's codified, like it's overt and codified in all these different ways. So I'm thinking, for example, of the ACA Code of Ethics. Like social justice defined in, ending all forms of intersectional oppression basically is like built into the professional ethics. And I think, I don't know the number, but like maybe half of states, something along those lines, a third of states use the ACA Code of Ethics to adjudicate like ethical disputes for their licensing. And like as we, move forward with things like the counseling compact and things get more standardized, it'll probably be all 50. But like even like, the CAPE professional dispositions, I mean, they specifically put in there with marginalized populations. So like the way that a lot of, professional gatekeepers and even licensing boards could see, like if you like say you're a therapist and you voted for Trump, they'll perceive that as evidence that you are not capable of working in a diverse, multicultural, and global society with marginalized populations. And like they can very easily take your license because you don't have their professional disposition. So it is like increasingly, or like the social justice and cultural competencies, like we're expected to be activists. Like that's actually like an expectation that we have in our profession, is to be woke social justice activists. So like I completely understand why, I mean, probably the majority of people are increasingly wary of seeing a therapist because like the profession is doing activism, and like you're just going to be like a victim or a tool, or like you're not no longer applying it in like a meaningful or dignified kind of sense. Like you're just like a tool for the revolution. And like if you happen to be a white man, it's going one way. If you happen to be in another demographic characteristic, it's going another way. But it's very like dehumanizing.
Yeah, like Katie was saying just now, activist was the number one role of a counselor, according to my program. The number one, and I remember that when they said that, was like, no, the number one role of a counselor is to sit with people in one by one or in small groups and families and help those individuals on an individual level, not to be out protesting or making political statements. It was a bizarre statement, and it was reinforced over and over throughout the course of that program. They spoke about things very politically. We received political messages all the time from our administration. We received emails calling Trump the occupant of the White House, telling us to defund the police and march for this and march for that. And, in my program, there was a heavy emphasis on being able to work in community mental health. And so, Susanna, when you're talking about the Trump supporter versus psychopath sort of split, we were being told we were talked to about how to work with clients who were in therapy involuntarily because they were forced to be through some kind of legal situation or whatever, and that we might work with people that were really challenging morally for us, like domestic abusers, pedophiles, rapists, things like this. And they prepared us for this idea. And yet we are not able to work with the Trump supporter. We can't, that's an untouchable person that's not even fit for therapy. That was like, be disgusted, direct your disgust over here. Be prepared to work with people from all sorts of areas of life. But no, that's a bridge too far. So there were lots of ways in which that was incoherent. I never did pin anybody down on that. And I kind of wish that I'd had a little bit more boldness then. If I could go back now with the clarity that I've achieved over the last couple of years of having really in-depth conversations with people about this and parsing it and picking it apart and developing social connections and supports among people who also are very philosophically and intellectually critical of this kind of work. If I could go back with that, I would challenge lots of things differently. I would ask them, how do you make sense of the Trump supporter? Is it a pathology? And if so, what's the diagnosis? And if it's not a pathology, then why can't we work with a person who is, one of 50% of this country who just happen to have a different political philosophy than the leftist political philosophy that seems to be really important here.
So, from what I can see amongst like upper middle class lefties, going to therapy is almost like a rite of passage to be part of the club in a way. But amongst conservatives, it seems like they're growing more and more skeptical of therapy. I see Matt Walsh always railing against how useless therapy is. Abigail Schreier wrote a book called Bad Therapy. I think there's understandable reasons why conservatives would be skeptical of coming to therapy, but what would you all say to a conservative who has some struggles with their mental health and might need some help?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would say be careful who you are selecting. I would be careful. So, but like I do believe in good therapy. I read Abigail Schreier's book and I think she makes some important points and I think there's some things that she's missing as well. But yeah, say, finding a good recommendation from somebody that you trust. If you have if you have a local religious congregation that you're a part of that you can find recommendations from those sources, go from that as well. So, and then just, when you can have a session with a therapist and you can just go ahead and ask them some of these questions. It's like, how does this play out in your counseling practice with somebody? How do you feel about, somebody that has some of these beliefs and just see what they say. I think that there's, you know, I'm hoping a lot of older clinicians perhaps that were not educated in such a politicized environment that are able to work with a wide variety of people with no issues whatsoever. It seems like that's got to be the case.
That's good advice. I think it's good to ask a therapist you're considering working with a lot of questions. Most therapists do a pre-consult phone call or brief meeting of some kind so that you can get to see whether this feels like a good fit and use that to ask questions if you're concerned about ideology. Don't be afraid to ask those things, like, tell them, look, I voted for Trump and I understand that a lot of therapists are pretty down on right-wing ideology and conservative political leanings. How do you feel about that? Is that going to be an obstacle to us working together? Just come right out with it. Ask the difficult stuff about the dynamic, because the most important aspect of the therapeutic alliance is the rapport that you build with your therapist. And if you're working with someone that you're going to feel like you're self-censoring when you're in the room with them, how are you going to get into the really important stuff that you're trying to tease apart? And I think that it's important to feel them out and recognize that the therapist, just like a doctor, I think we've given medical and medical adjacent professionals too much authority over our lives. This is a consultant that you're working with. This is just another person with another set of perspectives and education. They have a sort of a toolkit, if you will, that they've worked hard to develop, and they can offer you some support and guidance that might be helpful to you if things line up properly for the two of you. But this is just another person. You're not going to click with every person. You're not going to click with every counselor. So have that perspective that this is somebody that you're consulting with, and you want to make sure that your basic foundations are in alignment.
I concur with everything that everyone said. I'm just going to like maybe do like an addendum to just kind of point out that, of course, everything that we're talking about, obviously, like it's not going to be the right fit for like, say, somebody in like active crisis or things like that. So like, I obviously understand that. But I also just sort of want to point out that like those that where you can ask questions and discern in that kind of way, that is like a specific maybe like demographic of client, and that those who aren't necessarily like able to do that tend to be the most likely to get paired with some of the more radical therapists, like through things like BIPOC funds or culturally competent therapy, wanting them to be like, somebody who's like in a marginalized, like say they're homeless or they're experiencing like various forms of serious mental illness, like they're more likely to be paired with the radicals. And so while like I completely agree with all of that, I do just want to point out that challenge there, that like I've seen some absolutely insane professional bios, and like in my view, the only people that would even like consider that kind of therapist has to either already be like pretty far in the cult, or maybe like experiencing really acute mental health issues, and they're not like able to necessarily discern any of this stuff.
Yeah. I would add to that, if you are looking for a therapist and you have a need and you have the ability to make choices about who you are picking, there are different groups that have identified themselves as not that. So, there's critical therapy antidote. There is a group of conservative therapists. There's a whole website. There are also others that are starting to grow and develop. And I think that those are all very positive indicators. They're also, like Gabrielle, you pointed out how people have found you by word of mouth. Ask your friends, ask, if you don't feel comfortable being vulnerable about that, you can ask people in your community who would keep it private. Like if you are a religious person, you can ask your pastor or your minister to give a recommendation who they thought, was not part of that. Also there, many religious leaders are taught in pastoral counseling. So that is also an option. If you don't have any other guidelines to look for, look for somebody who is old, because even if they have come to therapy or teaching or, practicing it later in life, they at least have the life experience that is going to encompass a time when the worldview was quite different. At least from my experience, most of the people who are older and who are still in the profession, even if they have some of the elements of that in their thought framework, are not anywhere near as radicalized as people who are young and who are just coming out of school, and they've had varying doses of that K through 12, then university, and then in their master's program.
I think those are great suggestions, Susanna. And I would add Open Therapy Institute to that list of suggestions. Open Therapy Institute. I work as the referral coordinator, and we get prospective clients that submit their request for a referral on our website, and I help to reach out to our member network and connect people to therapists who have dedicated themselves to practicing openly without political bias. So this is a good resource. Also, a lot of therapists have moved into coaching. There are a lot of therapists who work as licensed therapists and also partition off a coaching practice for themselves, and even some therapists who have just moved to doing coaching. And that can be a lot of things. Coaching is a wide umbrella. I have a coaching practice myself, but a lot of times that's being done in order to avoid some of the overt medicalization that's happened in therapy, as well as to not have to practice according to some of these new woke standards.
So this is a group of people who has done a lot of very good diagnosing of what's wrong with therapy. So my question is, how do we fix therapy?
Fix K-CREP and the ACA.
I'm not sure. I know that some of you guys have also done some deep dives into KCREP and the ACA. I have been here lately getting into the law and licensure and those sorts of problems. And I think that whatever actions people are going to take, it's going to take a while, which is really frustrating. And I think for the public at large is probably not very comforting. But in my recent digging into these things, I think that there are two viable paths. One is for those groups who identified themselves as not a part of the advocacy mission in counseling. And I would say that looking at the history, where it really goes sideways is when when the ACA adopted advocacy as the hallmark of the profession. And so for those practitioners who are not about the advocacy part of the mission, a choice needs to be made. And what can be done is there can be, make a new competing organization for those practitioners that is going to work legislatively to create room for that different framework. So another ACA, there needs to be another KCREP in that regard so that there can be programs that will teach outside of that framework and hopefully adjust the master's degree arena so that it is a little bit more reasonable for people to get into the profession. um, the counseling degree has the largest or the biggest number of credit hours required of any master's degree. I haven't found one that comes close. The other option would be to create something completely new. Call it, come up with some sort of name, maybe move into specialized coaching or something, and then work to create professional room for that. There will be issues probably with the licensing board maybe trying to shut something down. And so, in creating something new, you'd want to create a national professional organization to manage that, to help fend off some of those licensing fights, which inevitably will come up. Questions that need to be answered is, what level of licensing do people want? There are a lot of cons to that, particularly in how it's adjudicated. And what you have is basically your competitors telling you whether you're good enough to practice in the field. To talk about a conflict of interest there. It's just, I'm not really sure how that is supposed to work well as currently practiced in any field in where it's applied. But those, I think, are the big ways structurally to move forward. Individually, I think there's lots of different ways that individual therapists can work to create room for themselves. But as a group, those are the two questions, that people need to think about and then start making movement in those directions. There are a few people that I'm aware of that have started some baby steps in those directions. If there is agreement, then people can really start to move faster in those areas.
I think, like following what Susanna said, an urgent, maybe more structural or legislative policy concern that we need to deal with is the rapid growth of the Counseling Compact. So the Counseling Compact is an interstate licensure agreement. It's a collaboration between the ACA and the Council of State Governments that do a lot of these like interstate compacts that are happening with a lot of different professions. It started, I think, maybe like 2019. So I went to an MPCAC school. So this has been like a particularly like acute personal thing for me. I started back in fall of 2019. It took me a while to get my master's degree because I had to take a lot of time off and like move to part-time because of health things. But like just in that, 2022 present time frame, it's just rapidly expanded this counseling compact where states are signing on. And in order to facilitate this interstate kind of licensure acceptance thing, you have to have some sort of super state standards. So of course it's ACA, the American Counseling Association, KCRAP, and the National Board for Certified Counselors, which does things like the national counseling or counselors, like a national certified counselors credentialing title. And they also do things like the NCE, which is like a major licensing exam, the NCMHCE, that's also a major one. But once this gets to be, I mean, I think it's this year that they're set to start issuing privileges interstate. But like once this really starts taking off, it's going to be almost impossible to roll back. But it empowers all of these, like this small group of, basically unaccountable, totally captured professional bodies. And so I certainly think we need to get alternative education, alternative, credentialing, all those kinds of things. But just like in the urgent meantime, like this needs to be interfered with. And then we can like offer states these other options. And like something that I've always, I'm thinking about and, kind of connected with Leslie talking about coaching and things like that. So that I wonder what it was like when counseling wasn't like a professional state licensing. I think there are maybe some like First Amendment conflicts there, especially when we're completely taken over by what is like a cult religion. But like even if not, there's a lot of religious practice that goes on in counseling, and I think there's it becomes very difficult to get like the harmful and dangerous things out, like Marxism, when the state can't like discriminate on a First Amendment basis for different religions and things like that. So I do wonder like the viability or like the necessity of professional licensing. I also see the positives there in terms of like, protecting the public and people having some sort of like recourse for malpractice and things like that. But it is something that I just want to bring up and kind of throw out there.
Yeah, I think that it desperately needs to be deregulated and that counselors should not be licensed by the state or the government in any way. I think that when you have a license by the state, you're technically a government agent, and now the legal system is determining what is a good life and how to help people. It makes counseling an inherently political act. And I think that that's entirely inappropriate. I think it should be deregulated. I agree that consumer protections are a valid consideration, but we have contract law for that. So if somebody says that they represent themselves in this sort of way and then they violate that, then there is civil recourse for that. It doesn't have to be tied to a state licensure. So my solution would be to radically deregulate, allow professional organizations to regulate themselves and determine what, well, then you'd see a ton more competition in counseling styles and certification programs could spring up that train people in philosophical counseling rather than this biomedical model that we're using so prevalently right now, for instance. So my solution would be end the state licensure process in the government's connection to counseling.
Those are good answers. Oh, go ahead.
I would add to that in our current day and age right now, with regard, I think that the primary benefit of licensing in the past was that somebody's license could be revoked if they were guilty of gross malpractice. But in today's age, you can have a reputation that follows you everywhere you go. It could all be organized by just having health grades kind of thing. And that would certainly have some positives and minuses, but it's definitely a way that those concerns can be addressed by the public in a way that we've seen works. It works on eBay, it works in other formats. And there's different ways that those concerns that somebody you're going to might not be good at what they're doing or be a bad actor. There are other ways that we could address that without having licensure, where you're enshrining this kind of cartel-ish kind of way to organize the profession, which is really not helpful.
I think that insurance reimbursement is going to be difficult for people to give up in the field. I think that's going to be like a challenge. But I certainly agree with everything that everyone says.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. I think that insurance is unethical for therapy. But that's a whole side tangent. I wish we could get into.
These are some big. I love the answers, and these are some big questions that we're not going to be able to resolve today because it's some tough things facing our field going forward. Definitely. Well, thank you all for a great conversation. This was wonderful. I very much enjoyed it myself. If y'all hang out just a minute till the upload finishes.